Great. Thank you so much to all three of you. And we do have a few questions that came in, and I'm trying to keep notes. We had some people who submitted questions during the registration, so I might pull from those as well. And some of them might be geared toward more one or the other of you, and some might just be kind of open. So I think just, Elise, since you were talking most recently, one of the questions that came in ahead of the webinar, well, there were a couple questions that came in related to measurement of social and emotional learning. And one in particular, I'm wondering if you have any insight on is particularly interested in the data used to measure social and emotional development and how you can determine equity in it. And so I'm not sure if you have any words of wisdom or if that's something that you have focused on as you've been focused on the measurement. Relatedly to measurement and assessment, another question that came in during the webinar is related to the assessments that you're using and sort of the role of those, what it should be and what it should not be when developing social and emotional skills with students and with young people. So that was a lot all rolled into one, and I think probably Jamila and Rose could weigh in as well. But Elise, do you want to take a first pass at that, and maybe in particular focused on how, if you've been able to, how you've been able to determine equity within those assessments?
Yeah, sure. I mean, inequity is a really complex issue, right? So no one assessment is going to get me there. And so I really try to use multiple lenses to view a child. So the ASQSC was at first the only thing that we were using, but it's really limited in what you can interpret, right? It's just a screening. It's not an assessment. The DECA focuses on resilience factors in a child. And so that's been a helpful addition to looking at the kiddo and identifies very line item specific social emotional areas of growth for a kiddo. And it looks at attachment, it looks at initiative, it looks at self-regulation, and then it looks at challenging behaviors. But I also use, in a more sort of qualitative, informal approach, I use like an ecological model where I'm looking at children, I'm looking at their community, I'm looking at their family, I'm looking at their classroom. You can't just look at an individual child, or I think you can miss the equity picture, right? You have to see the context of the life that they are living in the context of their community, and the historical barriers that they might face, and be an advocate in the face of that. So I definitely I haven't found an assessment that is going to be a miracle in that sense. But if I pull back and I try to get gather as much information as possible, you can get like a more holistic view of the child.
Great, thank you. I think I'll jump to another question. So Rose, when you were speaking, one of the things that you said was teachers a lot of times will say, maybe not a lot of times, sometimes, because teachers the benefit of the doubt, they're very busy. I don't have time, it's one more thing I have to do. And then that's a question that comes up when you are out in the field. It's also a question that came through when people were registering, is how do you keep teachers from feeling like this is one more thing they have to fit into their class time? And this, Rose, you had mentioned it during your presentation, but really any of the presenters, panelists, if you want to weigh in here about what are recommendations or what are things that have worked for you?
Yeah, great question. This is definitely one I hear a lot. So you want to think about a lot of different things, but the first thing that I would say is, as we are designing content, really incorporating the development of social emotional skills within that content all the time, and thinking about it not as, oh, okay, here's another thing that I want to do, but also, asking yourself as you're developing content, what are some skills that I can focus on? What are some of the things that are going on in my classrooms, especially if you're doing some of those morning check-in circles? What are some topics that are coming up with students? And, how are you potentially infusing those in your lesson plans? I saw an example lesson plan of a teacher who, was incorporating this idea of a positive body image within a second grade classroom, where she had her students draw cartoons and write sentences of dialogue between students, and there was a lesson plan. There was a lesson before that final product where they were working on some standards of writing and English language arts, but also, really developing some skills around positive identity, what to do when you witness a bully, what are the power in words that we might use if we're describing someone as fat or skinny, or some of those, that terminology. So she really just developed those skills within that academic content. I think another thing you can do is, as you're, thinking about anything you do, and we're talking about equity, just thinking about, who has access, to the content that I'm developing, who's represented, in the content that I'm developing, who's participating meaningfully, and really just kind of thinking about the processes that are happening within your classroom regularly to ensure equity. And really just centering it in what you're doing, versus thinking, okay, this is something in addition to, my already full agenda or full plate that I have.
Great. Thank you for that. Let's see. There was another question that came in the chat. At least this is for you, I believe, that related to the trauma-informed parenting class. Someone had a question about how often is that class offered? How do you get parents to participate? You could share a little bit about the trauma-informed parenting class.
It's kind of, I laugh only because I wish that I was doing that class as opposed to I have anything really concrete to share about it. It's part of a local trauma and resilience initiative that's working kind of in a more collective community focus. And it's one of the goals of that organization is to start to develop that, because it's really like it's a lack in our community. If you need parenting support or parenting help, it has to get really bad before you get access to that kind of help. Like your child has to have some kind of diagnosis or pathology that's being identified. And the only parenting program that we did have was the funding for that recently got cut. And so there isn't anything, and there needs to be. And so it's looking like we're just going to have to make it happen, right? Yeah, so I wish I had something more specific about it. Conscious Discipline has a parenting curriculum that you can look at there. I'll put the link to Conscious Discipline in the thing. So sorry, I can't be more specific.
That's all right. Thank you. Let's see, another question that came in the chat, and this is open to anyone, is do any of the presenters have comments regarding gender equity specifically? So either anything from the research or in practice that you've come across that anyone would like to share?
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for that question. So I don't have anything that is necessarily specific to gender equity, but I would say that a lot of times the conversation around equity is really tends to focus on racial equity. But I think that it's important to recognize that we do have lots of different subgroups that we need to be focusing on to make sure that everyone has access to SEL. And so I think a lot of the strategies that both Rose and Elise talked about really work for gender as well. And I think one of the big ones is really making sure to focus on the strengths of all particular students. So really trying to measure where can we leverage the strengths and where are there maybe weaknesses, and really combining those two things to develop specific strategies for students, so that it's not so deficit focused. And so that's one particular thing that I would think of that really kind of refers to gender equity, but also all different types of equity.
Great, thank you. And it looks like one of our participants did share a link to a survey for schools and districts to capture student feedback. So this is great, and it includes gender in the assessment. Thank you so much for sharing the link to that. So there is a resource that's in the chat for people who are interested. And I think this also gets at one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time is interest in students with IEPs and English language learners. So I think to Jamila's point, and perhaps in this survey as well, that is something that we should be focusing on as well. And I would like to bring up, I think, at least one more question that was submitted ahead of time, which is, what are the most common objections to implementation? And then what are effective ways to overcome those objections? And I'm wondering, either from Elise, your perspective from being just really close to implementation and seeing what that looks like as you've been working with staff to implement this, if you have some words of wisdom. Also, Jamila and Rose, from your perspectives, just what have you seen in terms of any objections to implementation, and any helpful tips for overcoming those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's going to be, there's always barriers to any kind of implementation. I would say our primary, one, we've had just that mindset that I was talking about before, right? A paradigm shift around how do you approach behaviors, and moving away from a more punitive traditional discipline model has been really hard for people to walk away from, even though the research doesn't support it, right? Because that's how most of us were raised. So there's something in there that feels maybe uncomfortable, or sort of involves some kind of shame reaction about, well, if my parents did, like, what does that mean about my parents if they did it the wrong way? I'm not totally sure. But that's a big pushback. I mean, we focus on conscious discipline, right? But we have teachers who don't always buy in to it, and so another barrier that we've come across is, and we're looking at ways to overcome this, is that kind of shotgun methods of training aren't effective. We know that's true. We can't just like scream the ABCs at a kid and expect them to know it. You have to it has to be a part of their everyday, and that's true for the adults. We need to be finding ways to help our teachers practice and provide coaching and ongoing learning. So we're looking at ways to integrate kind of a longer term teacher learning community or orientation process where we never stop training, as opposed to we do it once a year during in-service, because that's not working well for us. So that's one of the barriers that we've had, that we actually have some control over, right? Is like how we deliver the content.
Great, thank you. And that perfect timing. I think that brings us directly to the end. I did want to make sure that everyone has this information. You can follow us on Twitter for, follow REL Midwest on Twitter for the latest information, and also see our website here. I really want to thank all the presenters. If you go to the next slide, you can see how you can contact any of the presenters from the session today. I thought this was a lot of really good information, and just want to let people know that when the Zoom platform closes, there will be a pop-up for a feedback survey. We would love your feedback on what you thought about the webinar, suggestions for improvement. We're always open to that, and what you really enjoyed. Thank you so much, everyone. It was great hearing from everyone in the chat, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.